the next item on the agenda is to talk about the Federal Emergency Management Agency and their national guidance that we've talked about a couple of times. It may be good, Bob, if you kind of give us a little bit of a reminder about that and ask our guests to introduce themselves.
Sure. Well, thank you, Jim. First off, thank you to FEMA and the federal representatives for being with us today for what we think will be a good information exchange and conversation about the FEMA's proposed national guidance dealing with the floodplain management program, the National Flood Insurance Program. And the CAO committee members will recall that this really goes back to fall when Hampton came to us and we had discussions about the community assistance visit that was completed by FEMA for the city of Hampton. And out of that came some conversation about really where FEMA is, as a staff, is locked into trying to work with some requirements that are in the federal regulation that really say that development has a pretty inclusive definition. And of course the conversation's been around how we can really look at national guidance and procedures that addresses minor development in floodplain hazard areas. You'll recall that we had a couple months ago a meeting between FEMA representatives and our chief administrative officers and some of your key staff. And out of that meeting we were very pleased that FEMA agreed to withdraw the national guidance that was being published. We formed a working committee that's met on 2 consecutive Fridays between FEMA and 4 of our jurisdictions and their staffs to try to come at a reasonable approach, a compromise that we could all work on. So this is really that next step in that process where FEMA is proposing some national guidance for us to take a look at. They've agreed to come to the meeting today and share this information with you all as our region's chief administrative officers. And Nicole, it would be appropriate at this point, maybe I could, before I do that, why don't we do this? It might be helpful. We have a lot of people in the room. For our guests, and then we'll conclude with the federal representatives. Ben, could we start with maybe introductions, name, and your title, and who you represent? That might be helpful for everybody.
Ben McFarland, Senior Planner for the Hampton Roads Planning.
Steve Shapiro, Deputy Director of Community Development in Hampton.
Bonnie Brown, I'm the Senior Assistant City Attorney in the city.
I'm Amy Ring. I'm the Planning and Zoning Director for Alawai County.
Pat Roberts, Suffolk City Manager.
Neil Morgan, York County Administrator.
Keith Kennedy, Deputy Executive Director, HR PDC.
Dr. Pratt, City Manager.
Jim Baker, City Manager of Chesapeake.
Doug Smith, City Manager in Norfolk.
Brent Fedor, Gloucester County Administrator.
Michael Stallings, Town Manager, Town of Windsor. Peter Stevenson, Smithfield Town Manager. Welcome.
Randy Wheeler, City Manager for Coastal.
Sarah Bunting, City Manager of Hampton.
Cindy Ross, City Manager of Newport News.
Mike Johnson, Southampton County Administrator. Randy Martin, Franklin City Manager.
Diane Kaufman, U.S. Senator Tim Kaine, Representative.
Randy Keaton, Alawai County Administrator.
And Tom Elder, Director of Economic Development for Alawai.
Amanda Jarrett, Franklin Southampton Economic Development.
Kevin Hughes, Suffolk Economic Development.
Leonard Sledge, Hampton Economic Development.
Florence Kingston, Newport News Economic Development.
Greg Cyphers, I'm a lawyer with Williams Mullen, but also the chair of the Hampton Roads Economic Development Alliance.
Warren Harris, City of Virginia Beach.
Marvin Collins, City Manager, Williamsburg.
Great. And our resident guest, Mark, if you wouldn't mind.
Mark Gadulda-Gutrovsky, publisher of PortsmouthCityWatch.org.
Thank you. So I think you see we have great representation from our 17 jurisdictions. Nicole, why don't I turn it over to you to introduce your team and then begin the conversation with us.
Okay, great. So I'm Nicole Lick. I'm the Floodplain Management Insurance Branch Chief for FEMA Region 3, and I have 3 of my coworkers with me, plus Rachel Sears with me first, and all of them.
I'm Molly Kaput, Floodplain Management Insurance Specialist.
Charlie Baker, Floodplain Insurance Management and Insurance Specialist.
Same Hasek, same Pat.
I'm Rachel Sears. I run the floodplain management programs out of DC.
And then we also have 2 colleagues from VATCR.
Gina DeChico, Floodplain Planner with the Department of Conservation and Recreation.
And I'm Kristen Owen, also Floodplain Planner with CCR.
So Nicole, if I could ask, it might be helpful as we address the group and more we're in we'll do this in a round, right? We're in a central location, might help it make it a little more audible. Thank you, appreciate it.
Sure. All right, so, as we heard, basically, federal regulations say permits are required for all development in the special flood hazard area. That's pretty umbrella, pretty comprehensive. When you know, practically try to apply that requirement on the ground, you run into some issues like, do I need a permit for my rose bush if I'm just putting in some mulch? What does that really mean? Is it a bottomless definition? And, you know, all of us agreed pretty intuitively, the answer is no, it's not bottomless. There is a bottom. We want to apply some kind of common sense to that requirement and its application at the local level. So what we tried to do, and what I think this policy is trying to do, is put some parameters around how communities can comply with that requirement to permit all development in the special flood hazard area. And obviously, issuing an actual permit is one way, and it would, I think, clearly follow directly with what the regulations ask for you to do. But the alternative sort of outlined in here is you can also fulfill the requirement to permit development in the floodplain by having the local floodplain manager review, assess, and document either an individual project on a project-by-project basis or as a category of action or activity. So you might conduct a review and document that certain types of activities in the special flood hazard area will not have an impact or are in compliance with the other federal minimum requirements and those in your local ordinance. And then you could essentially sort of permit all of that development as a class of activities. So where we are right now is there is a FEMA policy open for national comment. And this policy was drafted and then reworked by the work group that was mentioned earlier. And thank you for the volunteers we had in supporting that. So I think, I don't know, you know, if any of the members of the work group actually want to mention anything about sort of what we added in here since we met last time. Because I think we came to a consensus that we could live with the language that was in here. I don't know, Randy. Right in front of me, I didn't know get it. He was shaking his head yes also.
I know
That's
that,
a good
Mary.
reason.
No, I already did that. I'll be glad to address it. When we had our bigger meeting, not the two follow-ups, but the bigger meeting, there seemed to be a real disconnect on how what they were intending to say was perceived on the other side of the table. And we discussed that at length in that meeting, and we have tried, and I really appreciate the effort, to sort of make sure, one, that what they intended was what we're perceiving, so then we can discuss what it should be. And I think, you know, we've made a lot of progress there. Now, people still have, I'm sure, some remaining issues. I have a couple, but instead of having dozens, I'm down to 2. And there are probably some other, I can see Bonnie, who was taking a real lead on this with Steve as well, but we've made a lot of progress. And so, no matter how bad we might beat you up today, it is worthwhile to recognize that and to thank you for it. But I don't really think we're going to beat you up today. But I'm ready. I'm ready with my 2 comments whenever you're ready.
Okay, so yeah, I think that's a good transition unless other folks from the work group wanted to make any comments looking at Hampton, Chesapeake.
Well, I would just say the same thing. From Chesapeake's perspective, I wanted to thank you. I think we're light years away from where we were when we started this conversation. I very much appreciate it. We also may have some suggestions, both short-term and long-term, of things that we're saying could help. But we're really talking about, I think the main thing that's changed in here is this reviewing classes of activities with limited impact. And that's really opened the door, I think, to make it palatable to us. And we very much appreciate it.
Yeah, I would echo that. I think that we're definitely light years from where we were. The classes of activity change is big. We had a really good discussion about what substantial improvements are and how FEMA interprets a lot of that language, how we interpret a lot positive, which was positive. And I also have 2 or 3 things that they're more specific, they're not an overarching, this is not good news. So I think we're refining it from this point, they have to make it work. Great, so,
Nicole, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. Could you talk a little bit about the process for the guidance to be finalized, the public comment period, and some of that timing, please? I'm sorry for
absolutely, no,
interrupting.
that's
That might be
perfect,
helpful.
that's right where we're going.
Yeah, so why don't I take that piece? So after our May conversation, I want to say my thanks to you all as well. I think it's your all's willingness to engage in that conversation, to be critical of it in that very positive way where we got a better product, really did help, I think, transform the policy. So thank you for that. We took it back. I think the worker did a phenomenal job really nailing down what the primary issue was. And so the draft that as we said, we did rescind it. The draft that we put back up on the website has a lot of people talking, but it's really much about the kind of the edges of it versus that really fundamental problem that I think that we all identified, which again, it was an intent issue, that it appeared that we had cast the net too wide, and we certainly didn't intend to do that. So the process going forward, we reposted that document on May 16th, so I think that put us at we had committed to a 90-day public comment period, so that took us out to August 23rd. So we're wide open right now for comments. We have plenty of time to really have these same kind of conversations with other communities. Our other regions are out having similar conversations. That'll go until August 23rd. We'll take all the comments at that point, consolidate them, do an adjudication of those comments. Depending on the significance of the comments, if it looks like we can adjudicate or if there's consensus around large ideas, we will usually go final after that. If it looks like there's some discrepancies or we want to do additional coordination, we could do another draft. So really, we're going to wait and see what the comments are. If it's a quick, like that's a great idea, accept, then we typically just go final. But August 23rd is our magic date for that. I would expect if we do go final that it will be finalized within, say, 30 to 60 days of that closing of that comment period. At which point this will be posted as final guidance.
Rachel, could you explain where this is located for comment?
Yes.
Did you share the link with the group?
I did.
Okay, so I think everyone here got the link leading up to this. Okay, they don't have it. We will share it with our partners at VADCR.
Sorry. Unfortunately, our FEMA website is not the most friendly to navigate, so it's usually easier to Google something with its name, but we did have the link, so we'll make sure that everybody at this meeting gets this link. But yeah, that's the place where you would go to find it, or anyone in this room certainly has a copy and can forward it on to you.
And then, so our goal for today, unless folks have, other ideas or things they want to get out, is really to get comments and take them in person on this policy. So that's what we're going to do. I know we did mention at our last work group meeting, Chesapeake and Hampton both have actually sort of drafted, and I think they're probably 95% of the way there, actual implementation procedures for how they will use this policy and implement it at the local level. So we did throw around the idea of maybe even engaging in some conversation about those, but they both are taking 2 different approaches, and so I think it'll provide a good model for other communities in the Commonwealth and even maybe nationally of ways that they can take this policy and implement it in a procedure at the local level. So those are out there as well if, we want to have that conversation. It was something we did talk about last time. But I think probably, we want to focus on getting comment on the policy most importantly, probably first, but I'll leave it up to you to make that call.
I was particularly excited about the procedures part. Because of the conversations we had, and listening to you all describe your implementing procedures, and to see even within with your region to see 2 or 3 variations of that, I think was very instructive for me. And if there is a willingness to share that more broadly, I think it would be very helpful to other communities as well.
Yeah, because the point of the policy is not to dictate how communities will, how their procedures are. We try not to be too prescriptive in that regard. I mean, and that's consistent with how the National Flood Insurance Program regulations are as a whole. Like we say, you have to have an enforcement procedure, but we don't tell you what that needs to look like. That's really community by community choice. So in a similar way, that, you know, what your permit process looks like is a local decision. And, you know, there are many ways to come at it. And the policy tried to stay above that, allowing for flexibility for communities to, you know, make those choices that were right for them. So with that, I think we'll
Should we open
open
it
it
up
up, yeah.
for comments? Randy, did
Can I
you?
go first?
Yeah.
Okay. Two, and one of which is a question which may or may not turn into a concern, and one is a concern that it didn't have when we talked before.
Okay.
I'll do my questions are, all on page 4, found generally between lines 108 and, line 127. I mean, yeah. I'll do the latter concern, the most recent concern first. One of the things we talked about on the conference call was potential ways to triage between things that need real permits and things that could go through the RAD process. And we discussed the substantial improvement. And I recall we're talking about it as, you know, a project or a series of things in close proximity in time, which would increase the value of the property, the real estate, not the land, but the rest of the property by 50% or more. And that makes sense to me. Since that time, you know, we've had our CAV visit, and we're being asked to consider changes to our definition in our own ordinance from that definition I just paraphrased to a rolling 5-year average. That's substantially different. So, which is it?
So, you're referring to a cumulative standard, so this is a common, but not, you know, all across the board, higher standard that communities voluntarily choose to adopt. It is not a requirement. You know, communities choose to adopt it for a multitude of different reasons, either to get CRS points or because they think they have actual issues.
So we don't have to adopt that? And
Absolutely
no
not.
one from DCR will tell us that we're not doing the right thing by not adopting.
You all don't have a state minimum that we need to be aware of.
We do not, and we were both, I mean, we both led the cab, and I do not recall that message coming across.
Okay.
So if it did, that was unintentional, except we might have mentioned that that is something that communities choose to do, but there is definitely no DCR
And
requirement.
there's
to do
draft
that.
language for that higher standard in the model ordinance that's identified that this is a higher standard that you could adopt, but it's not required.
Okay, I appreciate that clarification. The last time we went through an ordinance change, we adopted what you all looked at and said was okay, and then we got one of those letters from the same people saying, no longer okay, we're gonna suspend you if you don't do things. So, if it truly is optional, blinding, boldface stuff in your model might be helpful.
We do highlight things in red.
Red and italicized
Okay,
with
so,
captions.
so that sort of helps me through that one.
Okay.
And the other is a question in the first bullet, because we talked on the phone about the floodways, and we all either allow nothing in the floodways or all kinds of permitting and stuff. But I'm not familiar with 60.3CA. I've had it explained to me, but I've never read it, so I take that with a grain of salt.
C10.
Zone AE without a floodway. My community, you know, I looked at the report. We have plenty of AE, and we have no designated floodways. So does that mean that, am I in or out based on that second fragment? Because it looks like to me that we don't have a floodway, but we also have AE without a floodway. And so is my entire city not going to be covered then by this RAD process because I have AE and you've determined no floodway? Would I be better off if I had a floodway?
So you're all coastal inundation, right?
Right.
So this is in a riverine setting. You're right. We need to clarify this for a coastal inundation.
That's how it
area.
was explained to me.
Yeah.
So might I respectfully suggest, stop the first bullet after floodway in this section. Go to a second bullet that says for riverine situations, and then I'm totally good.
Yep.
We're working on that internally, because I
Cool.
yeah, we're taking notes.
And that, by the way, that takes care of one of our prime comments
too.
was that same thing.
Yeah.
That's a great catch.
We're working on that, cause that issue is great.
It's different, yeah, it's complicated.
Yes.
For those who have riverine settings, I'm not sure
was
we have a
my
lot
biggest
here, but where you have a riverine setting and a floodway hasn't been designated, that C10 provision is designed to say, where we haven't yet identified that area that if you develop in, it will cause a rise in the flood elevations, you need to do some additional analysis. If you're tidal, you're not gonna have that effect,
I love those answers.
Great.
If they're reflected in the document,
Yeah, so we
I rest my case. Bonnie probably not, but I will. Thank you.
Okay, yeah,
Bonnie?
Council comment.
Ours, we also had that as a comment, so that one's taken care of. A couple of other more minor than that. On the supersession on the very first page, this says that the policy does not supersede any existing policy, but what we were operating under, and you guys are well aware of, is the FEMA 480, which specifically has language in there about small project exemptions. And it says you can exempt, obviously, insignificant activities. So something about, is this a refinement of that policy, or it is more restrictive than, it's telling us we have to do the RAD, or that's how we meet this permit requirement. You can't just per se exempt, so you're nodding your head like you thought about this already, but, so that's.
No, that's a great
maybe-
point, thank you. So FEMA 480 has been considered guidance, and it wasn't noted as official FEMA policy, so when we went through this process, it wasn't a policy we were superseding, but I think what I could do is this policy does not supersede any existing policy, however, it does clarify language in FEMA 480. Would that be acceptable?
Yeah, as long as it is different from 480, so I think it is important to at least reference, I think it does supersede to the extent that it's in conflict with 480, but I understand what you're saying, one's policy, one's guidance, but the undosing, we think that
Sure.
they're controlling.
Absolutely.
Okay.
That's a great catch, yep, well, that's an easy change.
What is this, if I may interrupt just for a second? Is this a policy or is this guidance?
This is
Because it
policy.
says policy guidance.
Yes, indeed. So it is a policy, so for us, that means it's a controlling document. Guidance tends to, the reason 480, which is, for those, I'm sure not everybody here has read FEMA 480, it's our guidance to local officials on how to manage floodplain development. That document is, we call it a desk reference and study guide. It's actually a very light document in terms of here's some things you can do, so there's a lot of, here's some best practices and good ideas. That's what we keep as kind of the big guidance documents. A policy is you must fall within the confines of this. So
Yeah,
it
maybe
is a
we could
FEMA policy.
probably take the word guidance out of the
Yep.
title,
Yeah,
like
pick
it
one,
could be
yeah.
FEMA policy.
We'd be just
Satisfying
as,
national flood insurance program requirements, permit requirements for participating communities. But I
Love it.
do agree that's
so, you know,
important.
and again, not to interrupt, I'm sorry, but we would just as much prefer FEMA guidance instead of FEMA policy.
My concern,
Step
my concern though is that we've had the guidance out there, and I think what we heard loud and clear is it wasn't sufficient, because we were running crosswise with one another. So we have landed on the fact that we are going to issue a policy on this document, because we want there to be clear guidelines about where there's discretion within the local authorities and where we begin to have concerns. I think it's a little easier to have these conversations when we know where those barriers are. But we'll capture that as a comment, and if others weigh in, we'll see where that goes. Sorry, Mike.
We actually talked about this on the conference call, and you all explained that it didn't mean how we were reading it, but the more we read it, the more it still feels like it reads that way. So looking at, starting at, it actually appears a couple of times, but around line 90, 91,
Okay.
where we talk about the community finds the proposed project will not trigger any of the community's floodplain management regulations beyond the permit requirement. And then you all explained that you didn't mean that that meant we still had to do a permit requirement. But it reads like we are still, this is a requirement, that we're still having to issue a permit. It could be interpreted that way. So I sort of just wrote up some suggested language, so we don't have to go through that. That's really wordsmithing. But it appears a couple times, and each time beyond the permit requirement sounds like that's still a requirement. So,
Yeah, so we struggled with this a lot, of how to word this correctly, because what we're saying here is that the regulations have a requirement to permit all development in a special flood hazard area. That's what the regulations say. So what we're trying to do in the policy is provide avenues that communities can fulfill that permit requirement. And I get what you're saying, because if someone reads permit requirement, it's very likely that they think in their head the only avenue is issuing a permit, when we're really trying to allow for two avenues here, which includes this review, assess, and document process as well. And that can be done for whole categories of action. So
It's your red line.
yeah,
Well,
definitely,
I can
because
send
we
you-
agree it's,
We're in agreement
Yeah.
talking it through, but everyone who's read it,
Still
just
reading
read it,
on.
asks that question,
Yeah.
and I explain that we all kind of agree that that's what it means, but a couple of years from now, when the next CAD comes through, what are we gonna think that means?
Yeah.
We can fix it now.
okay, great.
Okay, we already talked about that list on the floodway and the AE without floodway. So beyond that, my last comment was on the implementation procedures, which is, if we all agree on this, I think we're in agreement that this is fine, the classes of activity process, but what is going to ensure FEMA consistently interprets the policy so that, we want to know now, hopefully, we can get some feedback from you that the proposed implementation procedures we put together are going to be acceptable under the policy, because if they're not, then we may have bigger comments on the policy. So maybe that's something we can talk about separately, but if we're understanding it right and those procedures we propose are okay, then I think we're okay. But if not, we'll need to know, and we'll maybe have more comments.
So,
Yeah, I mean, we have, like I said, I think we're 95% of the way, if not 98% of the way there for, what Hampton had proposed. So I think reasonably we could get there before the August, time period closes. As you know, we're meeting this afternoon, so, I am hopeful maybe we can wrap it up today. So I think we'll try to work it concurrently to, alleviate that concern, and hopefully we'll have this resolved before August.
Okay, then my last thought about that is if we get that general approval from FEMA, I'm happy to share that with everyone, what those procedures are. Wonderful. Definitely do that.
So one other comment that Bonnie didn't mention, going back to mine at 116, it's the one about the floodway. So the question is, if these are exempt, if you've agreed that these activities do not require a permit, however, the structure is still in the floodway, is it in or is it out?
So, I think as you all have explained, you have other, it's a good question.
So for example, if the house is in the floodway, and we have some, and somebody paints a wall, are they, part of our list would say that that's considered an exempt activity. But because the structure's in the floodway, are all bets off, and now they have to permit the painting of the wall because the house is in the floodway?
I think that you can set up a category of activity that says, even in floodway situations, this is not gonna trigger.
Yeah, the point of calling the floodway out is because it is a higher risk area, and there are more requirements, like causing no rise in the flood hazard, that we would want you to be probably reviewing those, on a closer basis than, but again, painting a wall probably would fall under a category of action. But, in a floodway, you wanna be extra cautious that you are still fulfilling the minimum requirements of the area.
The original ordinance doesn't allow any kind of construction in the floodway. So the other question is, if the de minimis activities occur in the structure of the floodway, they're assuming that you don't have to permit them, just like the other ones do.
So I get a little nervous with the we don't have to permit language, right? Because what we're trying to say with the policy is that there is a permit requirement. There are many ways there's at least two that we've outlined here to fulfill that requirement. So you are fulfilling the permit requirement by reviewing, assessing, and documenting the category of action and sort of saying it's compliant, it meets all the requirements, or there are no requirements that apply to it. Like painting a wall. I mean, you couldn't go through your local ordinance and find some kind of a provision that actually applies to that. So there would be no standard to review it against, if that makes sense. So we're trying to be sure that you've considered the categories of action and actually documented that they don't trigger a requirement in the federal requirement for your
So I guess, will you approve our list list at some point of all these activities. The fact that the house is in this floodway and performs any of those does not change things.
It won't for most of them, but it could for some like Phil.
So this will be a good one to bounce back and forth off the implementing procedures. So let's capture that as, we need to continue to refine that
Bounce it
bullet,
off, yeah.
and go back and forth on the implementing procedures, and let's see how those comments sort out. It's a good catch.
I think on that note, you'd infer that if it says may be determined, if it complies, and we're talking the same exact lines, 115 down to 127.
Gotcha.
You might infer that you may not, if those requirements aren't fulfilled, right? I think that's really where that concern sets.
Yep.
That, you know, according to the way that it's written, painting that wall, if you're in the floodway, it would have to have an individual project permit process
So
after doing the wrap.
the may applies to the community's decision. So, for example, if you had a concern about painting a wall in a floodway, you would have you would retain the right to say, I want a permit for this. The may is at the community level. They are determining whether it's compliant or not.
So perhaps a bullet at the bottom that lists, says, other inconsequential development as determined by the community.
Or existing
Inconsequential,
homes in the floodway.
yeah, inconsequential is the wrong word.
We wouldn't allow that at all, but for the existing home that was there before the floodway was designated. And one last thing that doesn't really come into the policy items, but I just want to keep it in the forefront of our minds at our first meeting, and I don't know if it came up in the conference calls as well. We talked about the problematic, we understand now, the problem you're dealing with is that the FEMA Act says development is any activity, which is overly broad. We all agreed, or we don't think Congress intends for painting an existing wall to be considered it, hence you're providing this guidance. But really, the ultimate solution is to clarify what development means in that overriding legislation, and I understand that that is up for reauthorization.
Actually, it's one level down.
One level down,
So it's
okay.
not statutory, it's regulatory.
Okay.
And so regulations are likewise a challenge. There's an executive order right now that says that we're actually reducing the number of regulations that are being promulgated. So it's a difficult time to undertake regulatory change. And in the best of times when we do take it, it's a FEMA average of 7 years to completion from the beginning to the end of regulation. It's okay, I laugh too. It's insane. Yeah.
Well, would it be helpful to you all if, as a group of localities, after we put this to bed, we continue to talk about the need to change that overriding definition? Because frankly, that's the heart of all of this, if I understand it correctly. And, to the point of successive generations of employees or reviewers or whatever, I mean, we have to fix the underlying root cause, which is what, Randy so eloquently identified at our first meeting.
Yeah, indeed. And we keep a running list of the things where, because of ambiguity or the construct of the regulations, we literally have a red line version, and we know there are things that need to be fixed in there. It's helpful to hear that. We keep it in the file so that when we are ready to go through a regulatory review, we know these things. So if you all do want to submit some sort of statement to us that this is the long-term solution, we'll absolutely keep that with it. And I mean, that's all I can commit to at this point. But
is it best done through this specific comment, or is it best done in another place, or both?
I can take it anyway. If it's in your comments here, I'll put it in my, it'll be good.
Because it's also in Chesapeake, that's probably our #1 comment, because not just that it needs to be fixed, but I think the other, from our perspective, this has been a very successful process with you. We've appreciated that and the interplay. But we also know that we deal with different people over time. And so as long as that definition in the regulation is out there that says permit from everyone. From our perspective, we all know that somebody else could come back to us another date and say, sorry about that guidance, now you need a permit for everything. So I think that would be important. The other thing that I would just mention, and again, I don't want to muddy up the progress that we've made, but the other thing that my staff is telling me is it would be very helpful. In the past, in cases, there's been model ordinances that have been promulgated, and we think that would be very good. Now, you may need to have a different one in the riverine type of than some of the coastal tide-based things that we're dealing with more here. But we think that would be very helpful. We're not trying to derail this, but doing that, and maybe even some of the discussions that have occurred with Hampton and Chesapeake, because we are, to tie back to what you were talking about, as I understand it, and I always hesitate to do this because I haven't seen what Mary and Bonnie and the folks at Hampton are doing, because I've been more focused on my own staff. But as I understand it, the two approaches that are being taken is Hampton is looking more to take the very specific activities and create exemptions. And we're more focused on doing some kind of performance-based, so we can describe to people the types of things that need permits and don't need permits. They're accomplishing hopefully the same goal, but it's two different approaches to it. And maybe that helps down the road to do some kind of model ordinance. But I think that would also be helpful to the extent that you guys can think about that.
Yeah, so, we already talked about each state typically has a model ordinance, Commonwealth has one. Probably would want to revisit the language in all of the models that we have in the region, probably nationally, even after, the policy is finalized, to allow some, suggested language in there for what communities can consider and how they can, navigate through this. Yep, I think it's a great, excellent suggestion.
That's great. Other comments? Yeah.
Just one for this. I think one of the areas of confusion is that while development is defined in regulations, permit is not. And I think having some sort of statement about when you say permit, what do you mean by permit? And I think in this case, we are very broadly defining permit. And having that stated earlier in the guidance will be helpful in clarifying some of the language that's still in there.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
I make this comment about large movement. We had in Chesapeake. We are learning every day something in regard to our federal government. We're in the midst of hurricane season. Are we assuming that FEMA is going to remain solid, no cuts, everything that's in place is going to remain in place with our federal government, or are we in a I don't know mode? We've got to wait and see. Not everybody. Wait a minute. I'm going to say not everyone speak at once. Okay. Thank you. You don't have to answer. Thank you. It's hurricane season, so we know we're going to need them.
Anything else that we need to discuss?
Thank you very much.
I'd be interested in you guys' perspective on ordinance versus policy. As FEMA takes statute, creates regulations, policies beneath that, and guidance to tell us what to do with the policies, that tell us what to do with the regulations about the statutes. We're thinking about ordinance and perhaps not even changing our ordinance, but instead creating a policy document to clarify the intent of the ordinance. Would just kind of appreciate any thoughts that you guys have on that.
So from my experience working with communities, administrative procedures is how we typically refer to it. I think you're calling it policy. It's something that explains how you will do something that the ordinance has adopted, actually better from a practical perspective, because as you implement it, if it's not working the way you wanted it to work, you can change it without having to go through the whole adoption process. A lot of communities have this for their substantial damage procedures, so the ordinance says we will to conduct these evaluations after disaster, but the procedure of how they do it is outside of the ordinance. And that initially was our kind of recommended approach, but, you know, that's really a community decision. It could also go directly in the ordinance. It's completely up to you. But I think as a best practice, we've seen this kind of thing work well outside.
Thank you for that. And as a follow-up to that, we're considering the RAD process applicable in two ways. One, from a holistic standpoint, looking at classes or types of activities that the local government applies the RAD process to create a permit for classes of activities. And that permit might just be a permit that goes on in a file with the local government that says painting walls is a permit. This is your permit to paint walls. If anybody needs the permit, you can come and take a picture of it, or we'll send you a copy of it if you want it. But we're housing the community permit to paint walls, right? Beyond that, for those items that aren't exempted through that kind of like universal permit, we're looking at asking the community and the development community to apply the RAD process and to self-identify those components based on our policies and our ordinance to come and apply for permits for those activities. Does that generally meet the expectation? Kind of that two-layer RAD. We do a RAD up top. We permit things that are really kind of the universal permits, and then all the stuff that's not accepted or exempted, the developer goes through the RAD process and comes and applies for the permits for those activities.
So the idea of the review assessment document is that the community official is, or someone representing the community is making the decision about what is exempt or compliant and what is not. So what you might do is have developers, you know, come in and say, hey, I think I have another thing that should be added to your sort of, you know, what you refer to as a universal permit. I think these things also fulfill the requirements. And I think making what the requirements are and what the kind of, you know, questions are or the standards that you're bouncing those against the public is a good thing, because you will get people, you know, saying, hey, what about this? Did you think about that? But ultimately, it is the community's responsibility in this program to be making that call. So having the developer decide they don't need a permit without you having it on your list, I think would not 100% be in line with the intent of this. You know, they could come in and say, hey, I'm not sure that I need a permit for this, and then, you know, you can work through it there as the community official. But I think you would want to have eyes on a new thing.
I think we're saying the same thing, but we depend on the individual that is contemplating the action to bring the action to our attention for us to take a look at it.
Yeah.
It's just like going to get a building permit. You could go and build a garage out in the woods and nobody knows about it until we do pictometry and we pick it up on our, you know, we pick it up on our assessment or something, and you know, no permits, no nothing, and there's nothing that we can do about it because we just don't know. Many of us, I think, operate in a very reactive realm because of resource constraints. We can't go and look at the mobile, the camper, right? The RV that's parked for 179 days and check it 180 days and determine if it's been there for, we just can't do that kind of stuff, right? So
I think where you're, anytime you get into the.
That was a Randy example.
Anytime you get into the business of making a list, you're going to create that space where, but what about, so I think, if I'm hearing you right, what you're saying is you're telling the developer, say, look, we know there could be other things, and to Nicole's point of view, a really great idea if you bring this to our attention so we continue to expand this list. But I think you're also kind of informing them of a kind of a buyer beware situation of, but know that if it's not on this list, and if it doesn't meet those criteria, you are still subject to compliance with this ordinance. And if that activity is undertaken and you haven't consulted with us about whether or not that you meant to include that, then you could be held subject to enforcement actions if it's an activity that should have been permitted. And I think that occurs in the building code space as well. So I'm sure there's some kind of lessons or you know, procedures that you can pull from that.
That's kind of the model that we were looking to apply, that building code model, voluntary, not aggressive enforcement.
Right, and when you see something then that you're like, oh geez, that's not on our list, you know, then you use
Stop
your
and you
enforcement
ask.
procedures, and that's in line with the
Okay,
program.
thank you.
Yep.
Anything else? I just want to thank you again for all the work that you've done and working with us, Bob and Mary and everybody else that's brought it to our attention. I can't say enough, but in fact, I will tell you, we had a public meeting last night in one of our boroughs, and everybody was complaining about FERC. And so,
FEMA?
not FEMA, well, they didn't get around to you, there's a pipeline issue that they were talking about. And they were saying that, you know, these federal agencies never listen to us, and we never have any input, so, you know, why should we even talk to them? And I actually said, hey, we're working with FEMA, and it's working very well, and so, you know, don't get in your mind that you can't do it, so I very much appreciate that.
Well, thank you all. This has really helped us advance on something that was a national issue that has plagued us in our, you know, ability to work with communities for a long time. So together, I think we did something good here. That is an accomplishment.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
All right.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks for allowing us time in this meeting.
Yeah,
You're welcome.
we appreciate that.
We're gonna go on to another topic, but
Yeah,
we're
I
not
think-
gonna be
I
offended
think
if you're
we're
gonna.